Now on most seams you're going to have, when you make a seam, it's going to be right sides together. The difference when you're working on a French seam, you're actually going to start with your wrong sides together. So in order to help you out, if you don't have a printed fabric you're working on, you can take and you can color on it, draw a line. This is going to be, the one I color on is going to be, let's say, my good side of the fabric. So normally, so I've drawn ugly little lines. So normally when you sew a seam, you would do it like this. Your right sides are together, so when you open the seam, you have your decorative fabric. Well, the difference is when we start with a French seam, you're going to flip it and do it opposite. It can be a little bit confusing, but you're going to go ahead and pin your seam together. If I actually get a pin and not a needle. Okay. Before we start sewing this, I know your instinct is to sew whatever the seam allowance is, but you need to determine what that seam allowance actually is. So we're just going to use this as a traditional commercial pattern, which is 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. What we need to do is we're actually going to be doing a total of 2 stitches, and that has to equal 5/8 of an inch. So because we could actually do it at 1/4 of an inch and then the second one at 3/8 of an inch, which I like to do. And on most of these machines, the edge of the foot, so the edge of this foot usually marks about 1/4 of an inch. So for my first stitch, since I'm going to do my first one at 1/4, so I'm going to start there. I'm going to immediately go with my back stitch to the end. And then I'm going to do my 1/4 of an inch all the way down. Okay, so now we have our first stitch. Now we're going to be flipping this over and sewing it this way in order to give us a clean finish. Now with muslin, it's really easy to do. You can take and finger crease it, and I like to do it with my nail, so I like to crease it down the middle. If you have an iron accessible and you have a fabric that, let's say, is not as friendly as muslin, you want to iron that open. So now I'm going to fold it, so I've got my seam right there. So I sewed 1/4, which means in order to make 5/8 of an inch, I can sew this one at 3/8 of an inch. So on this machine, I actually sew, I can always measure back, so I know where my 5/8 is. There's a mark for 1/2, and then on the other, there's one more mark there, which is 3/8. Get my needle up. Okay, so this one's a little bit harder. I'm going to line that up, get my reverse. My foot keeps getting stuck on here. Okay, now if you've sewn this well, when we open it up we will not see any seam allowance, no fray, nothing. So this is a French seam, so it's a beautiful seam. So it's clean on this side, which is going to be your outside of your garment, and on this side it's going to also be clean. Ta-da! Okay, here's another, we're going to do another example. This is one, let's say we're doing it at 1/2 an inch. I'm going to draw there. So with 1/2 an inch, remember we start with our right sides facing out. We need to make our 2 stitches equal 1/2 an inch. This one's not going to be as easy as the 5/8, so this one will start. Now we could break it down, so we would do 1/8 of an inch and then 3/8 of an inch, but that might be a little bit hard for a newbie to figure out. So we're going to start with your 1/4 of an inch. Now when we flip this over, so I'm going to crease my seam and open it up. Now if we flip this over and sew it at exactly 1/4 of an inch, there's a good chance that we're going to have the edges showing up. So what we can do is we can actually trim off our seam allowance. So I'm trimming off half of my seam allowance, which is basically about 1/8 of an inch. So then you can crease it, it's still creased a little bit. Then I'm going to fold it over right on my seam. And then you can sew again at 1/4 of an inch. And when you open it up, we have a clean finish on the inside and a clean finish on the outside. So compared to the one with the 3/8, you can see it's a little bit smaller. So this is a total of 1/4 of an inch. So you could maybe do this. Another option, you can use it if you have a really thin, like silk fabric, and you want to have a small seam allowance. So I'm actually going to look and kind of on the inside. So on the inside of my foot, I have like an opening in here. And I'm going to line this up to the inside of that marking. So here we have that 1/8 of an inch. And we have to be really careful because we have to cut this down, and you have to make sure that we don't cut it too small. Basically, we're just going to kind of cut it in half of what's there. So this seam allowance is a little bit too small to actually press open. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to kind of press it to one side. So I can kind of crease it to one side with my nail. And then I'm going to flip it over and fold it right on my seam allowance. So right where that seam line is, folding that. And the foot on my sewing machine keeps sticking, so I'm having a hard time getting the machine to stop. So I will take care of that when I'm done with this tutorial. In the meantime, you guys get to see the machine going nuts on me. Okay, so the second one we're also going to do at 1/8. So this is going to equal that 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And I don't know why this machine probably just needs a little bit of oil. So we're going to start with my backstitch. And there we go. That's 1/4 of an inch finished. And this one I actually did a pretty good job. I have a little bit showing through down here, so I have some thread showing through. And that's because I just didn't trim it back enough over there. But if you are going to have to trim it down afterwards, you got to be real careful. Try and use the nippers maybe to just get the threads. You're trying not to cut the fabric, just get your threads maybe. There you go. And that is for 1/4 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch French seam.